As we're looking at our class now at the discipline of theology, I thought we could take a look at what I'm calling the Catholic theological landscape. That is, what are some of the major schools of thought? Who are some of the major players that have affected and are affecting theology today? So this won't be an exhaustive history of theology, but really starting several hundred years back, looking at what forces, what ideas, and what people have shaped the world of Catholic theology that we're in right now. And so I'm following largely this book, brand new book by Tracy Rowland, called Catholic Theology. And we're going to walk in 3 videos through 3 schools of thought that are affecting still Catholic theology today. So Thomism, the Communio approach, and the Concilium alternative. And this will all hopefully become more clear as we go. She does a fourth school of thought that I'm not including here mostly for the sake of time. So I would actually really recommend this book for further study. The slides that you're looking at are mostly all either direct quotes or paraphrases of this book. So credit where credit's due. The material is coming from Tracy Rowland. My comments are my own, so they may be based on what she read, but they don't necessarily reflect what she's done. So I refer you to the book for more on this. So why don't we start with Thomism? And she gives no less than 17 different flavors or schools or species of Thomism that we can't possibly go through in these short videos. So I just want to highlight a few. What is Thomism? Well, you may have heard of Thomas Aquinas, and this is Thomism. Arguably one of the most significant intellectual traditions for the study of Catholic theology. There's a lasting value in Thomas's work. It refers to both the thought of Thomas Aquinas himself, the 13th century theologian, as well as all of his successors who have taken his ideas and developed them. So Thomism refers to both the thought of Aquinas himself, but also the various, we saw 17 different schools that would all label themselves Thomists. So part of the question is, well, what is the genuine thought of Thomas Aquinas? And that's some of the inner debates among these different schools, is who has truly appropriated Thomas. So among all those 17, you'll have both those who are debating how is Thomas properly represented in what he originally thought, but then you'll also have some of those schools trying to wed the thought of Thomas Aquinas to modern or contemporary philosophies or other schools of thought. So we'll see some of those as we go. So both appropriating Thomas, but also adapting Thomas. So we could start with what we might call classical Thomism, and that would refer to the original thought of Thomas Aquinas. Now the problem with that is many of the debates internal to Thomism are how to appropriate this collection. So it's between the different schools, there's going to be different ideas of what classical Thomism is. But the clearest example of this would be picking up the works of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas himself is classical Thomism. Well, if we're to move into more contemporary times, one title that's given to some schools of Thomistic thought is Baroque Thomism. And it's not a nice term. It was a term coined in the 20th century by Marie-Dominique Chenu, a 20th century Dominican theologian. And this Baroque Thomism refers to the commentaries on the work of Aquinas in the late scholastic era. So that is after the initial Protestant opposition to scholasticism. So scholasticism is this school of theology that developed, say in probably the 12th century and extended well past scholasticism exists today. You find high scholasticism in the time of Aquinas. He's probably its most notable adherent. And so scholasticism is trying to arrange the faith in a systematic way, and elucidate it through the use of human reason. But what Chenu is getting at with this Baroque Thomism, if you think of Baroque art, it's over the top, it's It's highly ornamental, right? He's trying to point to this form of reading Aquinas that's over the top, highly ornamental, has gone beyond what Thomas would have originally thought. And so you're talking about the 16th into the 17th centuries. The Protestant reformers heavily critiqued scholasticism as being too rationalistic, and the response was, part of the response was this, what we term today, Baroque scholasticism. So it includes commentaries of people you might encounter from time to time. Very famous Cardinal Cajetan. You look at the dates there, he's in the 15th into the 16th century. And then Francisco Suarez. Francisco Suarez, his name will come up again and again in these videos, these short videos. So you're talking 16th into the 17th century. So these are the commentators on St. Thomas Aquinas immediately following the Protestant Reformation. This term Baroque Thomism is a pejorative term, though. Chenu charged this Baroque scholasticism with being, and here's one of the keys, ahistorical. Extracting doctrinal propositions from Thomas without any reference to historical or intellectual context. So this is one of the fault lines we'll see as we engage into the 20th century is what's the role of history in theology? Do we have just this perennial philosophy or perennial theology out there somewhere, or is it all really embedded in a historical moment? And to what degree do we have to take that history seriously to really understand it? Well, Chenu was one who wanted to see Thomas in his historical context and said, well, this Baroque scholasticism of all of these later commentaries weren't looking at what Thomas was actually saying, but we're just trying to pick out kind of these little nuggets, especially to use against opponents to the faith, whether or not in their proper context that's what they meant in the first place. So in this period of Baroque Thomism, one thing we see happen is that philosophy acquires an autonomous status in studies. And this in a sense remains today. Before you do theology, you take philosophy. So you have Thomistic philosophy divorced from its theological context. And again, we'll see this is one of those fault lines, even today. To what degree can we separate a strict rational philosophy from the context of faith? And in this case, to what degree can we separate the philosophical work of Thomas, which was in his original work always wed to the theology? This is also an era that developed what's called two-level thinking regarding nature and grace. So the picture here is, well, the question is, what's the relationship between human nature and the grace of God? And the idea in this scholastic, this later scholastic Baroque scholastic period, the idea was that there is this kind of pure nature, and grace, God's grace, came as an added bonus from the outside, we could say. It's like a two-layer cake. Or you have, say, maybe the cake is human nature, and then we happen to add the frosting of grace. We call this an extrinsicist position. That means grace comes from the outside. Extrinsic comes from the outside of human nature. The idea here is that an extrinsicist position allows for humanity to have a pure nature independent of grace, which comes from without. Now you might be saying, well, that seems pretty an abstract kind of thing. This is going to have a big impact in the 20th century when we talk about where did secularism come from? How did secularism arise where all of a sudden it seems that there's this whole world divorced from any consideration of God? And certain scholars will point exactly to this in the Baroque period and say, well, this radical separation of nature and grace, all of a sudden you can have nature standing all by itself, content in itself. And in fact, it goes on here, the slide, to talk about this idea of pure nature. If there's this pure nature, then man, the human person, therefore, would have a dual beatitude, a twofold fulfillment. One natural fulfillment, according to our nature, and another supernatural, that would be heaven. And this, going back to Suarez, who we saw in the 16th century, this is the dominant Catholic thinking until the 20th century with Henri de Lubac, who's another figure we'll look at a little bit later. So one of the things that happens in this Baroque period of Thomism is trying to say that there's this separation of grace and nature. So we'll come back to that. Another element that's important, especially for our talk of fundamental theology in this class, is Suarez, again, fostered this propositional account of revelation that we've encountered. We've talked about this several times. It was Suarez who gave this idea that revelation was God revealing not so much himself, but rather those pieces of information about God, those propositions. And this is a position that was criticized in the early 20th century, or I guess the mid-20th century, by a young Joseph Ratzinger, who would become Pope Benedict XVI. And in fact, Joseph Ratzinger ran into problems with some of his postdoctoral work because he was criticizing Suarez, and you don't criticize Suarez. Well, we can move on a little bit. You'll see why this becomes important in a moment. We can talk also about Leonine Thomism. And Leonine refers to Pope Leo XIII. So Leonine Thomism refers to a particular period of time, really, that sought to revive the thought of Thomas anew after Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris in 1879. So 1879, you're talking just after the First Vatican Council, which we've studied in various ways. Pope Leo XIII wanted to revive the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And a hallmark of Leonine Thomism, this period, is the classification, again, of the philosophical Aquinas as a separate discipline from the theological Aquinas. So it's perpetuating that Baroque style of separating out philosophy and theology. A main reason for this revival of Thomas was to provide intellectual arms against various kinds of post-Cartesian and post-Kantian philosophies. So you'd have to know a little bit about the philosophies here, but these philosophies of the modern period really called into question our ability to know things. It was a calling into question of reason, with René Descartes, that's Cartesian, and Immanuel Kant, that's Kantian. So there's this turn in these philosophies to the subjective, to question if we can really even know objective truth outside of us, things in themselves. And then you can imagine that would do a lot of damage to the Catholic faith, which claims that there are objective truths and that God himself is objectively true. So the idea here is that this form of Leonine Thomism was engaged or re-engaged to answer these modern philosophies. So what would happen is that philosophical ideas from Thomas were extracted from him as this, quote, perennial philosophy, right? Impervious to any historical influence and marketable to intellectuals of any kind. So it was really seen by Pope Leo and a lot of church thinkers that this was the response to this modern philosophy, was plucking out some of the metaphysics of St. Thomas. Now, theology, yeah, that could be added on or kind of as an upgrade for seminarians and any other interested Catholics. But the real significance here was, for Leonine Thomism, this strand moving into the 20th century was plucking Thomas somewhat out of his historical and intellectual context to answer problems of today. Whether one wishes to read the philosophical Aquinas apart from or in the context of the theological Aquinas, that becomes a major fault line in later Thomistic schools in the 20th century. Can we really separate these two out? And again, the question of history. Can we really just pull Thomas out of context to answer questions he was never asking? This period, though, was very prolific and very prolific in its work around Thomas. So produced translations of Thomas Aquinas, centers of Thomistic studies, and work on what's called the Leonine Opera Omnia of Thomas, collecting a critical edition of all of his work. So very fruitful when it comes to studies of St. Thomas Aquinas. Well, that leads us now into the 20th century, this Baroque scholasticism into the Leonine Thomism really develops into what's known as Neo-Thomism. And we've used the term neo-scholastic in class as well. They're largely interchangeable. Neo-scholastic would be a slightly larger or more expansive term, and Neo-Thomism would focus on the thought of Thomas in particular. But this tends to refer to the Thomism of a particular period, again, from the death of Leo, 1903, to the beginning of the pontificate of Pope Paul VI. So you're talking the first half of the 20th century and then some. There's more than one school of Neo-Thomism, though, and we're going to look at three major ones. Some progressed along the lines of Leonine Thomism, that is, using Thomas's philosophy against modern philosophy. Some Neo-Thomists did not progress along those lines and took a more historic approach in contextualizing Thomas in different ways. So we'll look at three streams of Neo-Thomism. So again, this is the period from, let's say, 1903 to 1963, the beginning of the 20th century. We've labeled them here, along with Tracy Rowland, Strict Observance Thomism, Transcendental Thomism, and Existential Thomism. So there's some some intimidating but fun terms, and we'll peel back a little bit of this as we go forward. So let's talk about Strict Observance Thomism. This would be if you wanted to use a pejorative term, or the opponents to this would call it kind of fundamentalist Thomism. But this is the one that continues that trajectory of Leonine Thomism from the 19th century, mining those Baroque commentaries for bullets to fire at faulty philosophies. Its focus was less on the historical Aquinas' own texts than on carrying out the program of deploying a rigorously worked out system of Thomistic metaphysics, that is, the philosophy of being, in a critique of modern philosophy. Right? Those modern philosophies started with, well, epistemology. That's the theory of knowledge. How can we know things? Thomism starts, especially this strict observance Thomism, doesn't start with knowing. It starts with being. The being of God, the being of the world around us, and only later gets to how we know that. So this was seen as a kind of antidote, an ongoing antidote to these questions of how do we know things. Well, this is what's also called the philosophy or theology of much of the so-called manualist approach. And here we get to a point that starts to become even more important for the 20th and into the 21st century. This manualist approach refers to theology manuals, right? So if you would have gone to seminary, say in 1940, you would have bought a 3-volume manual set on dogmatic theology and a 3-volume set on moral theology, and those would have been your main textbooks. And they followed this strict observance Neo-Thomism, where certain propositions were given. This is very propositional revelation type things. Certain propositions of the faith were given in an ordered sequence. And then the work of theology in the manuals was to prove those doctrines by scripture and tradition and the church fathers and arguments for reason. So the benefit of these is they're very systematic, they're very clear. Your theological education would have been very consistent, speaking with one voice. It would have been very organic. It would have been very all-encompassing. But there were critiques of this, right? A major proponent of this, by the way, another name you might hear from time to time, still influential, is Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Lagrange taught at the Angelicum school in Rome, and another one of his claims to fame, besides being the major proponent of this school of thought, is that he was the supervisor for the doctoral dissertation of one Karol Wojtyła, who became Pope St. John Paul II. So this strict observance Thomism, though, is often criticized for lacking historical context. Again, of plucking things out of their intellectual context, out of the questions that were actually being asked. Was Thomas Aquinas ever really addressing Immanuel Kant or René Descartes? Well, no, of course not. It's anachronistic to do so. And here's our key point up to this point. Many of the great theologians of the Vatican II and post-Vatican II period were operating in a kind of reaction to this approach. That's key for what goes forward here. The great names at Vatican II and the period after, whether they were on the left or the right, they were all reacting to this manualist, neo-Thomist approach. They found it, to a man, they found it dry, stale, rigid, not connected to pastoral experience, just disconnected from human experience altogether. And so there was a a clear and decisive reaction against this way of doing theology, seeking to do theology in a different way. And that's what really brings us to the footstep of Vatican II when it comes to the theologians that were there. Well, we'll talk about two other forms of Thomism that were influential in the 20th century and still exert influence. One is Transcendental Thomism, and we peeked at this a little bit when we looked at, in some previous videos, at Karl Rahner's understanding of transcendental experience and transcendental revelation. So this is a second stream of Neo-Thomism. First we had strict observance, and this is a very different stream. It's a stream that takes on elements of Kantian epistemology. That is, it tries to wed St. Thomas with the theory of knowledge of Immanuel Kant. So as opposed to firing bullets at Kant, this one tries to accept Kant's critiques of knowledge and seeks a synthesis with aspects of Thomas's thought. The idea is if we start with Immanuel Kant's theory of knowledge, can we get to St. Thomas's theory of God and of being? So this becomes known as Transcendental Thomism because of the appropriation of what Kant calls his transcendental method. And that's everything that from that previous video of the idea that God and the experience of God stands behind all of our individual experiences. That is, that it transcends them as kind of the condition for our experience at all. So again, this refers to Kant's transcendental method from experience to the conditions for its possibility. So we have certain experiences, we turn to the subject, to the subjective. The question is, I have these experiences, what are the conditions that make that possible? And we saw that for Rahner, one of the conditions was the experience of God. So here's what Kant means by his transcendental method, trying to get around this. He says, I call every knowledge transcendental, which occupies itself not so much with objects, not knowing this or that thing, but rather with our way of knowing objects insofar as this is to be possible a priori. So what are the structures of human knowing that make knowledge possible in the first place, before we even know one thing, one individual thing? And remember, for Karl Rahner, that was the knowledge of God, even in an implicit way. So here are key names: Karl Rahner, and another important name in the 20th century is Bernard Lonergan. So this begins again with the epistemological issues, that is, theory of knowledge and individual subjectivity. It's not talking about being out in the world, but my experience, the experience of the individual. The dynamism of a knowing subject towards infinite and absolute being is an a priori condition of knowledge. This is, again, those previous videos. The grounding of the possibility of me knowing something is found in my openness to absolute being, which is God. That is, God is in some way always present as a horizon and necessarily co-affirmed with every act of human knowledge. The world, that is intelligible to Transcendental Thomists because we ascend to God in every act of knowing. So hopefully some of that was clear from the previous videos as well. But we're going to move forward here. Another school, and this one, I would say in my opinion, kind of did rule the day in 20th century Thomism. This is the one that came out probably forward from Transcendental Thomism overall, and that's Existential Thomism. You can see in the word there, it's going to focus on existence and the importance of existence. So this third stream is interested in the study of Thomistic ideas in their historical context, gives birth to Existential Thomism. Here's the idea. All readers of Thomas, top to bottom, agree that Thomas understands God's essence to be existence. Now, that's a whole nother topic, but the idea is God's whatness is to be. God is the sheer act of being itself. If you don't get that, that's another class itself. My essence is not existence. I could not exist. At one point I didn't. This is saying, no, whatever God is, it's to be. Okay, but existential Thomists, this particular school, emphasized the import of the act of existence for understanding all of the created order. So the idea is that the focus on the act of existence, that if you look at a rock sitting in a garden, what is that rock doing? The first thing you would have to say is that rock is existing. It's being. And that shapes the way we look at the world. A thing's essence, what a thing is, for all of the created world, is in essence what it is, with existence, the act of existing added to it at a fundamental level. Now that might seem, again, very abstract and not to have a lot of consequences, but for these existential Thomists, and again, I think this rules the day in Thomism, this is fundamental for understanding humanity, for understanding creation, and for understanding God, and for understanding God's relation to the world. So to go on here on the slide, it's not a mere fact that actual things happen to have being, right? It's not that things just are, but rather that being, or the act of existence itself, is the key to understanding the structure and nature of all things. Again, this is beyond our scope here to discuss the importance of this, but you may see it creep up in some other classes here. Key scholars are N.T. and Gilson. Gilson is one of the preeminent Thomists of the 20th century, and other names like William Norris Clark and David Schindler. And then I want to add one more here. Lublin Thomism, which came out of Poland, is perhaps the most important branch of existential Thomism. So you have existential Thomism giving birth in a particular university in Lublin to its own flavor of Thomism, and that's because of its most illustrious proponent, again, Karl Wojtyła, the future John Paul II. In his book, The Acting Person, he wasn't interested just in the universal human nature, kind of that metaphysics that looks at the abstract human nature, but he wanted to dive into that dimension of each human being which is totally unique and largely shaped and expressed in relationship with other persons. So he moves from the abstract human nature to the subject, to the person. The focus is on the anthropological dimensions of Thomistic thought. So looking at Thomas's thought and developing Thomas's thought on the human person. So kind of like, well, it's parallel, I suppose, where Transcendental Thomism tried to appropriate Kantian epistemology, or Kant's theology of knowledge. Lublin Thomism and John Paul II sought to develop Thomistic thought, the thought of Thomas, in terms of existentialist and phenomenological thought. That is, experience, being, and our experience of the world and how things appear to us, the subject and the person. So that's a brief overview of Thomism. What it does do is leads us into the two schools of the communio approach and the concilium alternative. And these two schools of thought, both of them are reacting, remember, to that neo-Thomist manualist style that they found ahistorical, dry, lifeless, and detached from human experience. So in the next video, we'll start with one of those two. That's the communio approach.